Imagine waking up in a world where everyone around you is slowly, quietly, disappearing. No war, no smoke, no wounds, no warning, just people strong, healthy, young, dropping into silence as if some invisible hand is erasing them one by one. Now picture this. Entire families vanishing across thousands of kilometers, without ever meeting, without sharing a village, a climate, or even a single rumor. What could possibly kill so many people so quickly, without leaving a mark? And why did it happen exactly when human civilization was supposed to be thriving? Today, we unravel one of the oldest, darkest mysteries buried beneath our feet, the prehistoric catastrophe powerful enough to reset entire populations, and maybe change the course of human history forever. It begins with a body, not a warrior fallen in battle, not a farmer crushed by his tools, not a child lost to hunger, just a young man, strong, healthy, in the prime of his life, lying still on ancient soil in what is now Latvia. No broken bones, no signs of struggle, no famine, no poisoning, nothing. A few hundred kilometers away, in what is modern-day Sweden, a young woman was dying the same way. No injuries, no violence, no desperation in her final moments, just fading, as if some unseen switch inside her quietly flipped off. They never met, they never shared a language, a culture, or even a trade route, yet their deaths were clearly identical. At first glance, these discoveries felt like tragic, but ordinary artifacts of prehistoric life. People died young, people died suddenly. That was normal. But then, archaeologists began to notice something that wasn't normal at all. These weren't isolated tragedies. Bodies with the same strange deaths without wounds patterns started appearing across vast regions: Finland, Denmark, Germany, the Baltic coast, scattered like silent footprints of an invisible killer. And then came the shock. Inside their teeth, sealed for thousands of years, scientists found traces of a microscopic enemy whose legacy humanity will never forget. Yersinia, Pestis, the plague, the same pathogen that would one day ignite the Black Death and the plague of Justinian, was already killing people thousands of years earlier, long before cities, long before written records, long before anyone even knew what illness was. This discovery cracked open one of the biggest archaeological mysteries of the last century. Were these early victims part of a forgotten pandemic? And could this ancient plague be responsible for the sudden, unexplained collapse of Neolithic populations across Eurasia? Because if so, it would mean human civilization didn't just stumble, it was knocked down. The more bodies they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern, one stretching across thousands of kilometers and hundreds of years, and the timing was unsettling, because these mysterious deaths lined up almost perfectly with one of the greatest collapses in prehistoric history, the Neolithic decline, a sudden demographic crash between 3450 and 3000 BCE, where entire communities shrank by nearly half. Imagine that. Centuries of growth, farms expanding, villages multiplying, trade routes forming, all erased in what felt like the blink of an eye. But here's where the mystery deepened. These people were not living in tiny huts scattered across forests. Some Neolithic settlements were massive, almost protocities, places like Medineski in Ukraine, home to tens of thousands of people, with longhouses packed shoulder to shoulder, no streets, no ventilation, just walls, heat, and noise. Perfect conditions for something small and deadly. Inside those homes were gigantic grain storages. The grain attracted mice. The mice attracted fleas. And fleas, if you know your history, were the ultimate delivery service for Yersinia pestis. That realization shook archaeologists. Not only were the signs of plague everywhere, the infrastructure of the Neolithic world was practically engineered to help it spread. Then came the most chilling evidence of all. Archaeologists began finding entire families buried together, dozens of individuals, all dead within days of each other. Some graves showed no signs of violence. Others were mass cremation structures deliberately burned, as if someone wanted to seal something inside. To early humans, the plague wasn't a disease. It was an unseen monster, a curse, a sudden horror that silently tore through homes and communities before anyone understood what was happening. And little did they know, this was only the beginning. The deeper scientists dug, the more terrifying the picture became. Out of more than 100 skeletons studied across Scandinavia, nearly 17% carried direct traces of the plague in their bones and teeth. That's not a mild outbreak. That's a catastrophe, one powerful enough to carve scars into population charts thousands of years later. And then came a grave unlike anything archaeologists had ever seen. A single burial site containing 38 people, all related: parents, children, siblings, cousins, entire family lines crushed in one sweep. 12 of them tested positive for Yersinia pestis, a mortality pattern almost identical to later pandemics, like the Black Death. But the most horrifying detail wasn't the number of bodies. It was the type of plague they carried. Not the bubonic form, the milder plague we learn about in school. Not even the septicemic form. This family was hit by the pneumonic plague. The deadliest version, the one that spreads through the air. The one that kills within 48 hours. The one that needs no fleas, no rodents. Just one infected breath. It means these people didn't just die. They died fast. They died terrified. And they died knowing the person who infected them was likely someone they loved. But the true shock came when scientists mapped the ages and relationships. This wasn't a single tragic event. This family had suffered 3 separate outbreaks over 120 years. Generation after generation lived under the shadow of the same invisible killer, never understanding why it kept coming back. The final wave was the worst, so destructive it could, by itself, explain the downfall of some of the largest Neolithic settlements. A world that had taken thousands of years to build was collapsing in mere decades, and the ancient plague wasn't done yet. Picture a world that believed it was finally winning. Agriculture had transformed human life, fields stretched further. Animals were domesticated. Villages grew into sprawling mega-settlements. For the first time, tens of thousands of people were living side by side, sharing food, homes, and unknowingly, their vulnerabilities. These places weren't small communities. They were enormous human hives. Longhouses arranged wall to wall, narrow passageways. No real streets, just endless structures pressed together. Smoke, heat, humidity, and bodies everywhere. It was the perfect environment for a microscopic predator. Inside these massive settlements were colossal grain storages, sometimes entire rooms. They were essential for survival: food, seed, trade. But they also attracted rodents. And rodents brought fleas, to a pathogen like Yersinia pestis. This wasn't just a good environment. It was paradise. Once the plague slipped into a settlement, there was nowhere to hide. People slept inches apart. Families shared the same cooking areas. Communities gathered in the same enclosed ceremonial spaces. And when one person coughed, dozens inhaled. Archaeologists began finding signs of panic structures burned intentionally. As if people hoped fire could stop something they couldn't. See, it wasn't a controlled ritual burn. It was desperation, a last resort. Entire districts were abandoned overnight. Villages that had thrived for centuries suddenly went silent. Tools were left in mid-use. Pottery sat half-finished. It was as if life paused mid-sentence. And across Eurasia, this story repeated again and again. Each new excavation revealed the same chilling pattern. Clusters of sudden deaths, hasty burials, mass graves, family lines cut short. This wasn't an isolated outbreak. It was a silent pandemic rippling across a continent, and no one living at the time understood what was happening. As scientists pieced together the evidence, a chilling truth emerged. This ancient plague wasn't a single catastrophic moment. It was a slow-motion disaster, unfolding over generations. The genetic data from multiple sites revealed something unexpected. Some skeletons carried traces of bubonic plague. Others showed signs of the septicemic form. And a haunting number carried the pneumonic variant, the airborne killer. This meant one thing: the plague wasn't just present. It was evolving, and as it evolved, prehistoric societies were crumbling. Imagine living in one of these mega-settlements, a place buzzing with life, just months earlier. Suddenly, people start coughing blood. Someone collapses during morning chores. A child disappears into fever overnight. A neighbor's home is burned down to stop the curse from spreading. Fear spread faster than the disease. As panic gripped these communities, violence began to rise. Archaeologists uncovered mass graves that didn't just contain plague victims, but people killed deliberately. Men, women, even children. Some showed weapon trauma. Others appeared executed. It's a dark human pattern we've seen again and again. when society feels cornered. Fear turns neighbors into threats, even without written language. The evidence is clear. People were terrified. They didn't know what was killing them, but they knew it was coming from within their communities. So they fled, but flight came with its own consequences. Sick individuals carried the pathogen across forests, coasts, river routes, and farmlands, unknowingly spreading the plague far beyond the original settlements. One infected traveler could doom an entire village, and soon, regions that had once been vibrant hubs of Neolithic life became empty ghost landscapes, scarred by disease, fire, and fear. But the most shocking discovery was still ahead, because this wasn't one disaster. It was three. The breakthrough came when researchers studied the burial of that massive 38-person family, the one torn apart over more than a century. By tracing their genetic relationships and ages at death, scientists realized something stunning. The Neolithic world didn't face one outbreak. It faced three separate waves of plague, each hitting new generations who had no idea their ancestors had suffered the same invisible terror. The first wave was harsh, but survivable. The second was worse, deadlier, faster, more widespread. But it was the third that delivered the knockout blow, the wave that likely toppled entire settlements, fractured trade networks, and erased cultural traditions that had survived for thousands of years. Across Eurasia, archaeologists found eerie signs of this third wave. Enormous settlements suddenly abandoned structures, burned to ash intentionally, entire communities relocating. Seemingly overnight megalithic construction, the pride of the Neolithic, abruptly stopping when you zoom out. You can almost picture it, a giant continent-wide pattern of collapse, like a slow heartbeat fading across maps that didn't yet exist. And yet, one mystery remained. Genetic studies hinted that the early plague bacteria might not have been fully specialized to live inside flea guts, meaning the classic flea-to-human transmission might not have been the main driver. If fleas weren't spreading it, then how was it traveling so far? Some researchers now believe direct transmission, airborne droplets from coughing, or exposure to infected animals may have been far more important than once thought, which makes the scale of devastation even more alarming. Because a plague that doesn't need fleas is a plague that can spread anywhere. By the time the third wave burned through its final victims, the damage was irreversible. The Neolithic era, once defined by growth and innovation, was now defined by silence. For decades, the collapse of the Neolithic world was treated like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Huge settlements vanished, populations plummeted, traditions evaporated, but no one knew why. Now, with the plague evidence on the table, a powerful theory emerged. Maybe this pathogen wasn't just killing people. Maybe it was unraveling an entire way of life. But here's the twist. Not every region was equally devastated. While some Scandinavian sites showed infection rates as high as 17%, others, like certain German cemeteries, showed rates as low as 1 to 5%, still deadly, but far less catastrophic. This inconsistency changed everything. It meant the plague alone couldn't explain the entire collapse. Something else, or several something else's, must have been pushing these societies to the edge. And when you start layering the evidence, a chilling picture forms first. Climate records show a noticeable cooling period during these centuries. Temperatures dropped, harvests shrank. Agriculture, the backbone of Neolithic life, became unpredictable. Less food means weaker bodies. Weaker bodies mean higher mortality. And in a world where plague is circulating, that's a lethal combination. Then there was the psychological factor, something invisible but incredibly powerful. As violence increased and communities burned their own structures in panic, fear became part of daily life. Fear drives people into large settlements seeking safety. Large settlements create crowding. Crowding accelerates disease spread. Disease increases panic. Panic fuels more migration. It was a vicious cycle, a loop that tightened year after year until something finally snapped. Suddenly, the collapse of the Neolithic didn't look like a single disaster. It looked like a perfect storm, a combination of disease, climate stress, social tension, and fear, all hitting at once. As archaeologists widened their investigations, a new layer of the mystery began to emerge, one that had nothing to do with bacteria or climate, and everything to do with human behavior. Some researchers proposed that as fear and instability grew, Entire populations began migrating toward mega-settlements, not because they were safer, but because people believed they were safer. Imagine hearing rumors that villages miles away were being wiped out by an invisible force. Imagine watching neighbors fall ill without a scratch. Imagine seeing homes burned because people thought the fire might trap the curse inside. Where would you go? Most people chose the same path. They ran toward the largest, most fortified-looking communities, the ones with more food, more families, more hands to protect you. But this instinct for safety did the opposite. It created crowding unprecedented in human history. Tens of thousands of people living in tight clusters, breathing the same smoky air, sharing tools, water, livestock, and sleeping spaces. Crowding affects more than disease spread. It affects fertility. Stress goes up, birth rates go down, malnutrition rises, child mortality increases. And when one or two generations experience this simultaneously, entire populations can collapse, even without a pandemic, but layered on top of a spreading plague, it becomes catastrophic. Then there's agriculture, the foundation that made urban life possible. As the climate cooled, crops began to fail more often. Lower yields meant less stored grain, fewer livestock, and a harsher winter survival rate. Weak bodies are easier prey for illness, for hunger, for violence. Now zoom out and picture all these forces stacking together. A plague that mutates across generations, a climate that slowly worsens, crowded settlements amplifying fear, declining fertility and rising violence, failing harvests, draining the population's resilience. Taken alone, each factor is dangerous. Combined, they form the kind of slow-motion catastrophe that can erase an era. By the time the final wave of plague swept across Eurasia, the Neolithic world was already wounded. Communities were smaller, infrastructure was strained, trust between groups had fractured, and the once thriving network of settlements that had powered early civilization was beginning to dim. But here's the haunting part. Even after all of this evidence, scientists still debate whether the plague was the main killer, or simply the spark that ignited a much bigger collapse. Because some regions that barely show traces of plague still experienced dramatic population declines, and in other places, the epidemic clearly ravaged entire family lines, yet neighboring settlements survived with minimal damage. This uneven impact suggests a world where survival depended on luck, geography, social structure, and perhaps even sheer chance. Still, the broader pattern is unmistakable. As big settlements fell, ancient megalithic structures abruptly stopped being built. These were massive undertakings that required coordinated labor, stable food supplies, and thriving communities. When the people disappeared, so did the monuments, like echoes fading in stone. Violence rose, trade routes dissolved, some regions became nearly empty for centuries, and yet, through all the darkness, there was something quietly extraordinary happening. Humanity didn't vanish, it adapted. Small groups survived by scattering into the countryside, living in smaller, more flexible communities that disease and famine couldn't overwhelm so easily. Over time, these survivors would give birth to new cultures, new languages, new innovations, the seeds of the Bronze Age. The end of the Neolithic wasn't a final chapter. It was a painful transition, a reset, driven by a combination of fear, climate, disease, and the fragile complexity of early civilization. A reminder that even the strongest eras can fall, and even the darkest collapses can spark new beginnings.